Welcome to the Policy Forum, which will be discussing young people, skills and development, specifically supporting development and the aspiration of the young people of South Sulawesi. As Professor Dewey said, young people play a key role in development in Indonesia, including in South Sulawesi. So according to the law, young people are those who are 16 to 30 year olds, and this is 25% of the entire population. And when the landscape is moving from agriculture to the urban space, the young people will also change. So how can we support their aspiration to achieve their dreams? So the research pair in South Sulawesi is focusing on the development along the railway track, which is going through Maros, Pangkep, and Baru from Makassar to Parepare. This is the first time we have the railway line in Eastern Indonesia, and it's part of the national infrastructure. This will open various economic opportunities for the people, specifically in South Sulawesi, and to take advantage of these opportunities, young people and people with disabilities need policies which support access to information and skill development. So how can we support the aspirations of the young people in South Sulawesi? Together with me, we have panelists who are members of the Research Advisory Panel. First of all, I will introduce Ibu Jana Hertz, RAP member and team leader of Knowledge Sector Initiative. Good morning, Ibu Jana. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. And now I would like to introduce the next panelist, Mr. Andi Darmawan Bintang, Head of Manpower Office, South Sulawesi. Good morning, Pak Andi. Good morning, Valerina. Thank you for being with us this morning. And now we'll introduce the other panelists who are very successful in their field. We have Pratiwi Hamdana, founder and managing director of Tenun and regional operation of Gojek, also member of the research advisory panel. Good morning, Mbak Pratiwi. How are you today? Thankfully, I'm good. Thank you for being with us. I would like to also introduce Binar Afilastari, Think Policy Society. Good morning, Mbak Binar. Good morning. So today we'll be talking about young people, so be ready. We'll be waiting for your ideas from Think Policy Society. Once again, I would like to let you know, as Professor Duya also mentioned, that in South Sulawesi, the population is 9 million and 40% are young people. So we do need to raise skill levels in being able to seek opportunities, especially along the railway line in South Sulawesi. So of course, it is necessary to have supportive policy initiatives. So my first question will be for Pratiwi as a young person.
Driver engagement Gojek. Saat ini regional operation Gojek Indonesia Timur juga.
So she's also regional manager in Gojek, and she also employs young people in Tenun. So she's doing a lot for the young people. So what are the challenges and the barriers that you face in your activities? Can you hear me? So based on my personal experience, the main challenge is the perspective of the public itself. So the public tends to believe that colleagues with disabilities have much lower skill levels. Although we know that there are a lot of government and non-government organizations that are providing training for people with disability, as well as the young people. But in the public's perspective, they still think our friends with disabilities cannot compete with those without disabilities. But through the Noon and through the foundation we had, which is Berdaya Bareng, we can prove that people with disabilities have just as much capability as others. People think, oh well, the young people from the regencies or rural areas might not have the same skill levels as young people from the city. Therefore, having this railway line development, I hope, will provide access to young people from the regencies to take part in various activities that are mostly being convened in cities. So that's a public perception. And secondly, is inequality in access and opportunity between people with disabilities and non-disabilities, and that applies both to the regencies and the city.
Saya ke Pak Andi dulu ya, Mbak Tiwi ya. Oke, ini Pak Andi tadi sudah dijelaskan oleh Mbak Tiwi soal adanya dua hal,
Something we talk about.
serta tadi kesempatan yang dirasakan sebagai tantangan utama.
And so she was talking about the main challenges in developing young people, specifically in South Sulawesi. So, Pak Andi, what are the policies of the provincial government for enhancing the skills of young people in South Sulawesi, and specifically those with disabilities? The government of South Sulawesi has actually conducted many measures and policy, and specifically for the empowerment of young people. In South Sulawesi, we have Regional Regulation number 3 of 2018, which in principle is directed towards how to develop the young people. There are work programs. It is a responsibility from both the central government, provincial government, and regency government to direct the young people in participating in development. Every year, we also provide assistance in the context of providing training for them and providing internships. In the context of people with disabilities, we also have a regional regulation from 2016, which specifically is for empowering people with disabilities in all aspects of development, especially for the young people. There's a specific feeling that they feel they have limited ability, so they think about being workers rather than being an entrepreneur. Access to capital is an issue for them. In the context of people with disabilities, my apologies, there's some audio problems. So there's a lack of self-confidence in their abilities. My apologies, there's some audio problems.
Pak Andi mengalami kendala teknis. Kami akan kembali ke Pak Andi bila sudah dapat bergabung. Pak Andi, apakah sudah bisa diteruskan?
Ya.
Pak Andi, can you continue?
Baik. Jadi untuk kalangan disabilitas.
So for the people with disability, there's other factors that is a barrier, an issue, because they are able, but because the community or the public feels that since they have disabilities,
mereka hal-hal yang pekerjaan yang seharusnya bisa dikerjakan oleh yang normal itu dikerjakan oleh normal.
So sometimes a lot of activities are done by able-bodied people and putting people with disability to one side. First of all, we need to provide education, and we need to overcome the barriers that they feel. Pak Andi, thank you. I think we understand your message. We'll return to you later. I'll go to Ibu Jana now, because Ibu Jana is working in the knowledge to policy translation, so using data to support policy, specifically on the young people, policy for the young people. Pak Andi talked about different policies implemented by the South Sulawesi government to provide opportunities to young people and people with disability to develop their potential. In your opinion, what are the policies thus far based on research, or are they scientific-based policies, so are they appropriate? Thank you for your question. I think what is important to raise in this forum is the role of the young people in developing policy, as well as advocacy for evidence-based policy. So in the knowledge sector initiative, the young people maybe not well represented despite having several really good initiatives. So we are supporting the Things Policy Society, which is represented today on the panel, to train the young people on the process of policy development in order for them to have a voice, so they know when they can have an audience, or how they can follow the process of policy development from start to finish. Of course, there's a role for research in that, and research is sometimes done separately in the academic world, uh, but there's no consultation in the beginning with policymakers. So we are hoping that research and the policymakers can be connected so that the outcome is truly practical and impactful, or has an impact on the appropriate target. For this forum, that's why it's so important to have research being done by the young people. And Madam Rector or the Chancellor explained the important role of university to support their university students to play that role. And hopefully, it's not just research, but rather policy research that is supported and that from the start has interaction. For example, with officials such as Pak Andi, so that the discussion can begin, the dialogue can begin, so that the research outcomes or findings can be applied. And there's a good example on our knowledge sector initiative where there's a cooperation between the South Sulawesi provincial government and the local research center regarding the recovery of South Sulawesi economy during this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And this also impacts on the young people. So our hope is that the young people have a voice in discussions and policy development. Thank you, Bujana. So Pandi, as a representative for the government, you can accommodate the wishes of the researchers to also be engaged in policy development in the future. Before I go back to Pak Andi, I want to talk to Mbak Binar, because Ibu Jana mentioned that this is one of the ways or the organization that has been successful in engaging the young people, and so mobilizing young people and policy development. Can you talk about that a little? Thank you, Valerina. I'd like to talk a little bit about Think Policy Society. So there's Think Policy and there's the Think Policy Society. Think Policy Society started quite simply as one of our co-founders just returned from studies in public policy, and she felt the discourse or the training on knowledge sharing regarding public policy is lacking in Indonesia. So she opened a boot camp. I'm one of the alumni of the boot camp in the first cohort. Now we're on the third cohort. So there's a lot of demand actually for this. As we know, young people are part of the government as analysts, as executors, but they do not yet have the appropriate capacity building. So our society have 14,000 followers on Instagram from across Indonesia. And ultimately, to be able, so that we can work better, we have the Think Policy organization. We call it a social entrepreneurship in the area of young people capacity development, specifically in public policy, not limited for government, but for someone like me who works in NGOs in government, such as Tiwi, working in Gojek, but also in government relations, which is also part of our community, our society. And in addition to developing capacity, we provide a safe space to network for young people who are concerned on public policy issues. And that's it, more or less. But from your perspective, so for young people, when we're talking about human resource development, what's your perspective on that? For human resource development policy that the government has, I think is quite good. We appreciate this in the Ministry of Education and Culture, especially for higher education. We have the independent campus. So learning is not just on campus, and that's doing, that's good, and we see that the government has an employment program, so that's upskilling for the young people. But once again, the challenge is that usually in the ministry, there's a lack of coordination, so there's a sectoral ego amongst the different government agencies or institutions. So the interventions are sporadic. We would hope that it could be more integrated. So the young people used to be children, so usually teaching them and sharing about problem solving skills and critical thinking is something that, this is an assumption. Perhaps those of you who are researchers can confirm this, that should be taught since primary school or even since kindergarten. So there should be a roadmap for teaching critical thinking, and so we would hope for a comprehensive intervention and not a sporadic intervention. Thank you, Binar, for your reply. I'll go back to Pak Andi. So we heard from the comments from the other panelists. If I may know, what is the priorities from the South Sulawesi government, especially for the development of human resources, specifically for young people? The South Sulawesi government's policy, as I said before, is that we have local government regulation on development, and for the young people, which is defined as 16 to 30 years old, we do have developing capacity in the form of training and internships. We also have training on how they can be self-sufficient, and that's training on entrepreneurship. And the South Sulawesi provincial government provides capacity building for institutions, whether those they are standalone or those who are affiliated with certain organizations. So that's for the National Scout Movement, the government organized youth movements. And this is done through integrated programs between the private sector, the business community, and the government. The central government provides programs, which is not just about training, but also providing technical assistance and providing opportunities for contributing to development. So the issues that Binar mentioned regarding the engagement of young people in participating
yang dimulai dari tingkat rembuk desa sampai perencanaan nasional di tingkat pusat. Namun tentu hal ini memang,
and this is something
bisa dimonitoring secara terus-menerus, di mana
and this is something that we need to monitor so that the young people feel represented in development. So there should be there's digital reporting in the context of young people providing input to the government, and not just young people, for all society. Thank you, Valerina. Very well. But so for people with disability, are there anything more specific? Is there anything more specific that the government has done? And as Dewi had said, there's a perception that people with disability might not have the same ability as the young people in general. In 2016,
setiap perusahaan itu wajib sebenarnya menyediakan sebanyak 2% dari keseluruhan
So from
pegawai di
overall,
perusahaan.
from all the workers that,
Syarat yang akan ditetapkan
so one of
buat
there will be requirements. My apologies, the audio is cutting in and out.
bagi kelompok seni
There should be facilities provided to people with disabilities
terkait
regarding
maupun
accessibility to employment opportunities.
sudah
Thirdly, we have,
ditetapkan oleh pemerintah pusat
as the central government has established,
banyak atau sejauh mana perusahaan yang mempekerjakan
there is some assessment
kami
regarding the private sector employing people with disability. We are in the top 6 where the private sector are employing, are providing 50% of employment, or 50% of the workforce in the private sector comes from people with disabilities. So to the participants, if you have questions for our speakers, please write these in the chat box or the Q&A. Please state your name, where you're from, your organization, and who your question is addressed to. And I'll go back to Bujana. So we heard Pak Andi's explanation. There's a lot of measures taken by the South Sulawesi government, and especially mandating that there's a 2% quota of employment for people with disabilities. In your opinion, how can we maximize research outcomes with the backdrop of the policies being implemented? Thank you for your question.
Memang banyak sekali penelitian yang sekarang dilaksanakan terkait dengan isu difabel, juga terkait dengan
with regards to, there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of positive action. There's Australia-Indonesia Disability and Research Advocacy Network, which is very active in bringing together researchers in Indonesia and researchers in Australia regarding issues in Indonesia. It's very positive, and there's a lot of research being done with this focus, and there are many policymakers such as Pandi who's very open to observing or studying the research outcomes to see what the local government or the regional government and the central government can do. So this is a positive development that we've seen, that from that we hope will continue to develop from a KSI perspective. And for pair, so that research issues can be discussed from the beginning, so that the real issues will be researched and that the policy can influence each other. There's tension between the two, but this is a debate that is crucial. And in the Knowledge Sector Initiative, we call it knowledge intermediary. And that's a role of civil society as well as community-based organizations to disseminate the outcome research and to advocate to the government. Sometimes there are many key issues, so it's difficult to prioritize, to determine what the priorities will be in development. So if there's cooperation between researchers and the government or the policymakers, as well as with the role of the intermediary, there should be a public debate or dialogue, so that it's not done behind closed door, behind the screen, but rather something that's discussed in public. So once the policy is being implemented and it's being supported, the public would be aware of it. Thank you, Bu Jana. I'll go back to Mbak Pratiwi. What is your aspiration to improve the quality and the employment opportunity for young people, including people with disability and women? From me personally, there are several aspirations that I have. First of all is educating about how we are able to educate the public and the employers and convince them that young people especially are friends with disabilities should be given the same opportunities to work or to have a business, as Pak Andi mentioned. Secondly, although I, I, this is the first time that I've heard that it was 2% minimum employment. I thought it was 1% that the private sector needs to employ people with disabilities, but in its implementation, we have not found many companies that are ready to handle this sort of regulation. It is important to educate the employees and employers or the human resources department that they have people with disability have the same ability. And if they're not considered to be capable, there should be training that can be provided both from the government. In Makassar, we often work with the social department, but we think there are others that can provide training for people with disability so that they have the same skills and abilities so that they can enter the workforce. Those are my hopes, Valerina. So, thus far, do you think the policies implemented by the South Sulawesi government is appropriate, is the same as Ibu Jana mentioned? Is it evidence-based? Is it so I've only just employed or collaborated with people with disabilities in the past 2 years. From my perspective, in Makassar, there are a lot of organizations or social institutions that employ people with disabilities. But in the Regency level, I'm not sure of the situation, but in Makassar, it's good, it's well aligned, and we want to educate the public and the private sector. Are they ready to employ people with disabilities that have been mentored by government and others? So there's a difference perhaps from a demographics and geographic perspective. So those that are closer to the capital have better access. Correct. So we'll ask Binar before I go back to Pak Andi. From your perspective, do you see the same issues? Are the policies inclusive? Are they involving all the young people, including the young people? Thank you very much. South Sulawesi is quite progressive. They have earmarked, or they have guaranteed 2% of workers, and that's more progressive than other areas. But in my opinion, this is a means to an end, so this is an endeavor for a greater purpose. So the greater purpose is inclusivity. So these figures should not just be met from a quantitative level. We should look at the quality as well. Other speakers have already talked about educating the public, and from my perspective, because we have the regulation, it's been translated into the government budget. The budget is important. There's a gender responsive budget. Could there be an more inclusive budget, a more people with disability responsive gender, and making sure that the teaching materials can be accessed by people with disability. So it shouldn't be like no action, talk only, which is sort of slang in Indonesian. So, Andi, so once you've heard the explanation from all the other panelists, in your opinion, how does the education and local and international training organizations such as Tanun, and there's I think Policy Society, then a Knowledge Section Initiative, how can their presence support the South Sulawesi government in human resource development? Please unmute.
Baik, Makasih Mbak Valerie.
Thank you, Valerina. I'm sorry, he seems to be muted.
Suaranya di-mute kembali. Ya.
Baik. Sudah kedengaran Mbak Valerie?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Baik. Kami mengharapkan
So we are hoping to have support, especially in mentorship and the policies that we have taken. This is actually part of the public's wish for bottom-up development. But there are some shortcomings regarding information technology that can be developed for the rural communities, because we do need to ensure that they're developing from a digital perspective and in the context not just of training and capacity development for young people and people with disabilities. We hope for support in the provision of equipment that can be used for developing knowledge with field practice. For example, vehicles that can be dismantled and put together again. And for the young people, if they have the aspiration and the willingness to work, we want to ensure that they can develop their abilities so that they can work based on the abilities that they have. And finally, we do hope that our colleagues, researcher colleagues, can contribute in research which is ongoing to provide input for us to talk about what shortcomings we need to improve in developing the young people and people with disability. That's it, Valerie. Thank you for that. We hope that it can be implemented through cooperation with all the different parties. Before I go to other speakers, we do have a question in the Q&A box. So to all the participants, if you do have a question to ask, please type your question in the question and answer column on your Zoom screen, and you can also address this to a particular panelist. So the question is from Muhammad Akbar. I'm Muhammad Akbar from the South Sulawesi Independent Adolescent Alliance. Considering the COVID situation right now, there are many young people who have no employment there, and it's very difficult to gain employment. What is the Manpower Office doing about this? So we have quite meticulous planning on developing the ability of the young people through training and internship. But COVID has been a very impactful situation. However, we do hope that we can rebuild. We are endeavoring to accommodate the young people who have been impacted by COVID-19. And as we know, South Sulawesi, there have been 80,000 employees impacted, and about 40% are young people who have been terminated or are forced to stay at home. And so we're hoping by 2021, we can conduct training both for capacity building and self-sufficiency or independence in creating employment opportunities or doing their own business.
Sebenarnya kebijakan apa yang bisa kita lakukan untuk membantu kaum muda dalam kondisi COVID saat ini?
Oke, kalau dari saya pribadi, berdasarkan pengalaman saya, memang semua aspek terdampak ya, termasuk dengan.
So all aspects are impacted by the lack of opportunities, but it could be considered as a good opportunity for young people.
Karena kita lihat banyak sekali institusi atau lembaga-lembaga yang menyediakan pelatihan-pelatihan untuk kaum muda, dan itu
this is
akses dengan gratis dan sangat mudah.
so there's a lot of training that can be accessed freely through the internet. It's a right time for young people to upgrade their skills and ability. So once we have recovered quickly, they're ready and they have new skills so they can compete in the workforce.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Binar.
Ya, baik. Mungkin senada dengan Mbak Pratiwi ya, karena sekarang kesempatannya kita di rumah, tapi sebenarnya banyak sekali kesempatan.
Although we're at home, there's a lot of opportunities to learn, not just hard skills or to be an employee in a particular area, because we know we're aware of Industrial Revolution 4.0. So we want 21st century skills, critical thinking, ability to negotiate. And, this might be a little bit of an advertisement. We do have modules that can be accessed freely by anyone. So if you wish to learn about this, and there are obviously a lot of other sources. We are also developing policy through the support of the KSI. Thank you, Bujana and KSI. Perhaps these policy recommendations can be released, and specifically in education and in manpower, labor. So thus far, how enthusiastic are the young people to learn to develop their own skills through the programs provided by your organization, by Think Policy Society? It's a high enthusiasm. So the bootcamp itself, once again, thank you to the Knowledge Sector Initiative. The second and third cohorts were supported by KSI. We can actually only have 30 to 40 people in a single cohort because it's intensive learning. There's 16 modules and it takes commitment. So, and it's all done after office hours. So there are full-time workers, NGO employees, government employees. Usually we have 500, 400 or so applicants. We only accept 30 to 40. How do you select 30 to 40? So it's very strict. It's like a postgraduate course selection. So there are essays, and we also take into consideration diversity, so gender, because the third cohort is online, so we are trying to be as inclusive as possible, making sure they're spread out across Indonesia. So that's an alternative that we provide. So it's an online academy, and there's written modules as well. So when we have online activities, usually we have hundreds applying. So we're very happy that there's the young people in Indonesia are actually very eager to develop their capacity. Very well, thank you, Binar, for sharing your experience. So that shows us that the young people wish to advance, but maybe there's not a lot of opportunities for 500 applicants. You might be able to accommodate 30, so where are the rest are going? So maybe that's something that we all can work on together. I'll go to Bujana. Binar mentioned that KSI provides support for training organizations such as this to allow education opportunities for young people. So what is the background for the support, and how can research institutions to get this opportunity, not just Think Policy Society at the noon, but others who wish to get support? Could you tell us how they might do that? Thank you. I'd like to congratulate Think Policy Society because they have developed such an interesting curriculum, so it's very attractive, and there's a long queue. So if I was doing my bachelor's degree, I would be in the queue as well. This is part of what we do at the KSI that I'm very enthusiastic about that. This is where the future of Indonesia lies. If they develop their skills early on, as Binar said, critical thinking, negotiation skills, etc. We can hope that for evidence-based policy, and that these policies would support all the groups we mentioned before. The reason the program that I represent, KSI, supports the Think Knowledge Society, they are able to connect theory to practice. So they talk about the process of developing good policies and how to include research in that. They also develop opportunities, and they can hear from experience, and they can learn about real-time issues. They're given homework to research a particular policy issue that is currently being discussed. So the results of their homework or their studies can be utilized immediately, and it's really interesting. I'm hoping that the universities or the companies that wish to invest in the future generation would find that this is an opportunity to do so within some policy society with other programs, which teaches theory on policy developments, but also allows opportunities to interact with the policymakers. This can also be done at the subnational level, for example, in South Sulawesi, where we have PAIR at UNHAS, the University of Hasanuddin, and opportunities to interact with policymakers such as Pak Andi and other officials who are open to listening to the opinions of young people. To answer the question from the participant before about the program for developing greater employment, and this is from conducting action research. South Sulawesi has been able to develop action research on the development of the silk industry as part of COVID-19 economic recovery. It is possible that there are other action research that specifically look at opportunities for young people in the economic recovery process. This is a mechanism that the government can allocate funding to research and development policy or NGOs to look at particular issues. And this can be used for developing a specific program. And this is ideal cooperation that we are hoping for, where there's input from the public, there's research, and this can be inform real policy that has a real impact on society. So there's a lot of opportunities to be explored. Ibu Jana, there's a question for you from Anggito Abimanyu. There's a lot of company that has a requirement of physically healthy as a minimum requirement for employment. Can we assume that people who have lesser physical ability can reach the SDG goals in 2030? So the question is, can it be assumed that people who have physical impairments can reach the SDG goals? I can't predict that. But looking at the people with disability in Indonesia, as we said before, they're very capable, but there is some stigma in the general public. There does need to be a lot of work to do that, and there should be collaboration with researchers and policymakers. So you need to be aggressive in pursuing several targets, but looking at the capacity we have right now, there's no reason not to achieve the targets.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Jena.
Thank you, Jenna. So perhaps for Pak Andi from Baharudin Abidin, I think what he means is currently in South Sulawesi, there's a lot of, this is in English, there's raining and farming. Why don't we develop agriculture as an alternative to promote rural development? And this allows, this will guarantee the next generation, employment for the next generation. So is agriculture a priority that can be developed to accommodate the young people? Very well. South Sulawesi does make use of the agrarian area. South Sulawesi is
menyediakan pangan untuk 27 provinsi Indonesia. Jadi kami memang memprioritaskan, betul dan dikatakan Pak Fahad tadi, memprioritaskan pembangunan pertanian tentu dengan.
And the agriculture sector should be developed using a
di mana kita mengembangkan pertanian tidak hanya berkembang pada pertanian tradisional, tetapi
and it's not just about traditional agriculture, but rather further develop agriculture. So we need to look at value added processing. So I do agree that we should increase young people's knowledge according to the context of where they live. For example, if they are in an area with opportunities for agriculture, for example, in rice, their training should be on that issue. If they're in an area with plantations, we should focus our training on the biggest revenue earner in that area. So I do believe, and our young people should be trained according to the potential in the area, and that is part of our program. My apologies, there seem to be audio problems. So that is part of our program, which is developed according to the local context. Thank you to the speakers. We are limited in time, but based on our discussion, I have drawn 3 conclusions. First of all, there are challenges for the young people, and they need support for developing their skills. There's a perception of the public, especially for people with disability, the opportunities that might be should be more supported by integrated policy for developing the skills of young people. Secondly, there's some recommendations or advice. There should be a dialogue between the researchers, people with disability, and young people, so that the policy will be based on real or valid evidence, or there needs to be a role and involvement of all parties, be that government, non-government, and all institutions representing the interests of young people and people with disability to implement these policies so that development can be inclusive and sustainable. So that's our discussion today. So I would like to say, as what President Sukarno said, that give me 10 young people, I will rock the world. We hope that the young people of Indonesia can rock the world. Don't you think so? So we hope that this discussion will be of benefit to us all. Once again, thank you to all the speakers. We have Pak Andi, Mabina, Pratiwi Bujana, and Professor Dwi, who's opened our session today. And thank you to all the participants.